Welcome back, everybody. This is not a Malazan video. It's not even a Forge of Darkness video because I didn't get to read any Forge of Darkness today because my life is an utter hellscape and it's also way too warm. Anyway, this is instead me talking about the Silmarillion, which I wanted to do. I actually did this morning, and then my neighbors decided to have heavy construction, lawn mowing, and other stuff happening in the background, and I hate editing, so I'm just going to re-record. And I hope this will work this time around because I'm running out of beer. So there's that. Let's talk about The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien. Cheers. So I've just reread it for the, I don't know, fourth or fifth time, I guess. Something around that. And I have a very special connection to The Silmarillion because it is actually the last book I ever read in like actual print. That's the last book I, started and read, and I read like most of it. I think I got all the way to like the end of like the War of Wrath and everything like that, and then at some point my eyes gave out and I couldn't finish the rest of it. And no, at the time, because those were the days before Audible, back in the day when we had to listen to stuff on wax cylinders, shit like that. I remember my mother actually read the rest to me. Like she read it like on tape and sent me the tapes, and then I could actually finish the rest of the Silmarillion. So it's always gonna have a very, very special place in my like heart, life, and whatnot. Also, thanks, Mom. Although I'm pretty sure you never watched this, so that's good. I hope. Anyway, point is, the Silmarillion is something that I have read a lot of times. It has a lot of like special connections for me. The Blind Guardian album, Nightfall in Middle Earth, being a concept album about the Silmarillion, was like the first metal album, like actual heavy metal album that goes beyond Metallica and Iron Maiden I ever bought. So there's like a lot there for me. So I might be biased when I say that I love this book. But I figured let's ramble about the stuff that I like about it and why I like it, and why I feel what I feel is important to know, or like how to maybe get into it to understand why it is so great. And that's sort of where I'm going with this today. Yeah, it's going to be rambly. It's not going to make a lot of sense. So let's start with one thing that I really want to get out of the way straight up. A lot of people say the Silmarillion is the Bible for Middle Earth. Fuck no, it ain't. It's not the Bible. And I have strong feelings on that for a bunch of reasons, because I feel the term Bible is loaded with so many meanings and problematic ideas and whatnot in our day and age that it will like immediately set you up for the wrong expectations. If anything, the Silmarillion is closer to, say, parts of the Pentateuch and parts of, like, I don't know, say, Judges and Kings or whatever. Maybe. So only Old Testament there. Also, no Leviticus, no Numbers. That's not in there. We don't get, like, rules on when to stone an oxen and when not to stone an oxen. Spoiler, it's when the oxen kills a person and does it again. Also, then the owner of the oxen gets also stoned. Just Bible things. Point is, it's not the Bible. It is mythology, and parts of the Bible are mythology. It is historiography, and parts of the Bible are historiography. It uses mythological language, and parts of the Bible do that. But for fuck's sake, not everything that is mythological is the Bible. Not everything that's historiography is the Bible. We've had both outside of that one book. So now that's out of the way. Let's look back at it. The Silmarillion is a collection of stories, a collection of tales that you can read as either a cycle of myths or as a collection of historiography, or maybe, and this is like where you maybe can like draw the Bible connection if you really want to. That being, it is both a collection of mythology that slowly morphs into historiography, as do parts of the Bible. But you also get similar things happening in, say, Greek historiography mythology. When you read Herodotus, he starts out by looking at the Trojan War and stuff like that. So that whole change from what we might call mythology to what we may call history has always been a gradual change in every type of culture. So don't compare it to the Bible, just think of it as mythology. Because, and this is the next big thing, there's rules to mythology, and the Bible fills some of them. The Silmarillion fills all of them. Mythology has a bunch of like functions. I'm going to focus on two of them here. There's more of them, and I'm not a scholar of mythology, so don't blame me if I miss stuff out. But you can, yell at me in the comments. I appreciate that because there's far too little yelling going on there so far. So be violent. I don't know. Don't go against rules like community standards, but be angry. Anger is a good thing. All right, back to it. There's two things that mythology does. Thing one, it's etiological. What does that weird word mean that I just said? It means it gives us explanations for why the world is the way it is. That can be something like a creation myth. Killing some frost giant and taking his body parts to create the universe, or whatever. Creation myths are weird. Or it could be a story of how the cuckoo became the bird that does whatever it does. Where you get more like fables. Etiology is making up stories to explain why the world is the way it is. That's one big thing that mythology does a lot. Nowadays we use science for that, but back in the days of high adventure, we used etiology, mythology, that is. And that goes all the way up to the 1930s, apparently, when J.R. Tolkien wrote the Silmarillion. Well, whenever he started from like the 1920s to the 1960s and whatever. Point is, etiology. It does that. The other big thing is mythology, just like every type of literature, is about exemplifying aspects of human nature, aspects of the conditio humana, the human condition, or condition humaine, if you want to be like really fancy and shit like that, and questions of morality. That's why we read novels. It's like we kind of look at that and try to put ourselves in the place of specific people and figure shit out on like what it means to be a human person. But also, general like how to live our lives and stuff like that. That being said, in mythology, because it's old and very simplified, idealized in a way, characters in mythology are larger than life. They are examples of specific traits. You can use the word archetype if you feel all Jungian about it. They're like very exemplified in a way. So they don't engage in morally gray things unless that's exactly their one character trait, see Loki or other trickster figures. And they don't engage in very detailed dialogue. That's not how mythology works. You tell an entire story in like 3 or 4 pages most of the time. Unless it's the Iliad or the Odyssey, which, take a lot more pages. But in general, mythology packs a lot of like plot into very short, in very few pages, or a short thing, because like usually it's a story that's told orally. So you sit down, you tell the entirety of the story of how Jason traveled all through the Mediterranean, fucked over his wife, and got killed because he had it coming, or something like that. You know, and you tell that in like 3 hours, because after that, you can't remember anymore as a storyteller, and probably everyone around the campfire is drunk. Point being, mythology condenses a lot of stuff. We see rather abstracted, idealized characters engaging in rather abstracted things. And it's up to each and every one of us who consume that kind of thing to sit back and, crank that crank in the theater of the mind and add all the stuff our imagination can come up with, right? That's what we do when we read mythologies. Like you go and read, I don't know, Bullfinch's mythology if you feel like romantically old or whatever, like drunk in nostalgia. Or in Germany, you would go and read Gustav Schwab's Sagen des klassischen Altertums, which, you know, is basically the same thing as Bullfinch, just in German. 19th century compendia of mythology. Pretty cool stuff, but, you know, it condenses that shit. And the Silmarillion does the same thing. So if you come from reading Tolkien or modern fantasy, you expect a novel. And that's not what you get. It's not that. It's mythology. It's a compendium of mythology and history. Is there dialogue in there? Yes, there is. Is it highly fucking stylized? Of course it is. It's like, that's important to understand, and it's up to you as the reader, up to us as the readers, to take these individual stories, expand them in our minds for as far as we want to take them, or ignore them, because, you know, not everything is important that happens in there, and make them interesting for us. That's how that works. And once you are aware of that, I feel the Silmarillion can be really, really entertaining because it has a few extremely unique things going for it. So let's talk about them, shall we? First of all, it is, and you know, we've spoken about that before, Tolkien is not the founder of fantasy, he's not the inventor of fantasy. True. But he might just be the one person who not only invented a fantastical world, he's not that person, but who actually went about creating its creation myth, its mythology and so forth, in the way that mythology works. And that's what he does here. So we start with the Ainulindale, the story of how the world is made. The whole 9 yards, a full-on creation myth, and it's a pretty unique one. It's not, you know, not fully unique or anything, but it's pretty unique. The idea of like having the creator spirit Eru Iluvatar birthing the Ainur, and then they start singing these songs, and their music, like the idea of music making creating the world, is not unique. It's very, very much influenced by what you can see in like Finnish mythology in the Kalevala, which you should totally go and read. The Kalevala is an impressive piece of work. It has a lot of problems. It also has highly questionable views on sexuality and bears or something like it. But you know, it's a good book. Go read it. It's also proper mythology. But the point is, like, the idea of singing as a creation of the world is pretty cool and relatively unique. And once again, no frost giants were harmed in the creation of this world, so that's something. And then you have all these details, like how they raise pillars with lamps to keep the world lit, which is like very much how you would imagine like etiology works. Like, there's light, so obviously there's a lamp up there, and you know, the lamps get toppled, and then you have the trees building up with the flowers of the trees that illumine, and that's actually pretty fucking magical and beautiful when you think about these ideas. Is it couched in highly stilted language? Of course it is, because that's like how like mythology was presented at the time when Tolkien wrote that story. And you could totally make, just out of that like first thing, or like the creation of the trees and shit like that, you could make an entire novel out of that. And that's sort of the point that I'm trying to make here. This is not a novel. It doesn't even aim to be a novel. It's a collection of stories that could each and every one be expanded into novel-length stories with like side characters, individual plot, like motivations and doubts and whatnot. You could totally do that. Just like we have nowadays, like retellings of mythology where we just focus on one character or whatever. That's something that we can do, but that's not what Tolkien set out to do. So we have that. We have influences, like we have an underlying tension within the world, that duality between good and evil. that we see. I don't say is necessary for how to say. I don't say it's necessary for a universe or a belief system to have a duality between good and evil, but it really helps understanding the universe, right? It's like for us, it's sort of why we in Christianity had to invent a devil. And when we look at the fall of Melkor to what he becomes in the Silmarillion, this is not like, Old Testament stuff. This is like more like Paradise Lost Lucifer, because I'm not a theologian, but there's not that many mentions of Satan in the Old Testament, as far as I know. There's only the Satan in the Book of Job, and that's very different from like Lucifer, like the fallen angel, and so forth. So anyway, having a dual system of belief, or like a where you have good versus evil powers that sort of vie and kind of have an influence on human, or in this case also elvish motivation and shit like that, helps explain the innate stupidity and pettiness of sentient beings. So having that in the background makes a lot of sense. And since we're on the level of mythology, we can read them as given. The next thing that is important is that we have all these characters that have like embody specific traits. You have Feanor, that like spirit of fire and power and eagerness, and with great power comes also always the chance of great arrogance. It's like forget about the responsibility. With great power comes great arrogance. That's what it is, and that's sort of where Feanor comes from. That idea, that continuous idea, like continuous need to push up against boundaries and break those boundaries and not be hemmed in or ruled or whatever. That makes Feanor really interesting as a character, and he gets played dirty by everyone else, right? He still fucks up because don't take that kind of vow, don't be an asshole, don't go kill other elves and whatnot. He overreaches incredibly, but he has his points in a way. I guess that's like the other lesson that you learn is like the power of evil only works if good isn't all good, because that's anyway. Point being, mythology also often follows a very like a lot of specific pathways or arcs in a way. The classic one is that you also see in a lot of Greek tragedy is the idea of hubris and the fall after hubris, which you see a lot of in the Silmarillion, right? Like Feanor is a classic example. King Turgon, later on when in the fall of Gondolin, is another like perfect example of hubris and the punishment for hubris. Even more perfect, obviously, is Akalabeth, like the rise and fall of Numenor, obviously. But we're not there. We're not there yet. But the point is, we see these like very very basic kind of narrative arcs that we have come to expect, or have become very very familiar with from like early on, which are both like a thing that drives narrative but also drives human behavior. It's like if someone rises really high and starts getting cocky, we peasants down here can't wait to tear him down, or them can't wait to tear them down because hubris and so forth. Anyway, another thing is that we basically have all these like individual stories, and some of them have later on been like picked out and taken down and turned into individual stories. They've been released as individual books, that being like the Children of Húrin about Turin Turamba, and the Children of Húrin obviously, the Fall of Gondolin, and Beren and Luthien. Those are like these individual stories where we actually zoom in, where Tolkien kind of zooms in during the Silmarillion onto like almost individual narratives about people. And all of those are great. The releases, I feel, are like, if those stories interest you and you're into like nerdy things, then go buy those books and read them, because you get like different versions. You see how Tolkien tried to develop them and so forth. But it's more like reading textbooks and studying and reading sources for university than going and reading and enjoying a novel. And that's obviously the other thing. There's like, you can't say this too often. This is not a novel. This is not written for your enjoyment. In for our enjoyment in the way that we enjoy a novel. This is not what that is. What it does is show us like examples of human or elvish behavior, its consequences in a highly stylized way. It has a lot of drama, a lot of tragedy. Like almost none of the stories in this book end well, right? Like everything gets destroyed all the fucking time because everyone's stupid all the time. And I don't know. I look around and it's like, yeah, he's got a point, doesn't he? So there's that. But I wanted to, pick out a few things that I found really interesting and things that we maybe overlook when we read it. And it's like, oh, it's all so dry. We have that battle when Fingolfin, hiking of the Noldor, goes and challenges Morgoth Melkor, who is, for all purposes, basically a god, to a fucking duel, and they fight. And yeah, because this is mythology, it takes like 2 paragraphs. Like, yeah, Morgoth comes out. He doesn't really want to, but he does. And then he takes his hammer, Grond, and then he punches like 7 holes into the ground. And then finally he gets Fingolfin and kills him. It's like, and that's it. Now you imagine that in, say, anime, or like even like today's CGI movies. That would take like half an hour of battle, like at least. Marvel would make like an entire movie out of it, basically. And this is just like 1 page, and we tend to just like read through that and then take it apart. Like, you could just like sit back and think what just happened. An elf has just challenged a Valar, a god, to single combat. First of all, the god is afraid and doesn't really want to do that. So what a fucking badass must that guy be, that elf? And then they actually fight for like probably hours. But it takes a while because this is like a huge fucking epic scale, and we tend to just like, oh, it's dry language. Let's like just like look to the next page and what happens then. And I get that, but just like that's sort of what I'm trying to say here is like, you read those are just like sketches and notes of what happened, and then you, as the person who learned that mythology, can go and sit back and tell the epic tale to your people as a storyteller and embellish it with all the bells and whistles and individual things that these kind of things, stories need to make them interesting. This is not how those stories like should be portrayed in the individual way. This is just the compendium of it. And as I said, we get closer to it, I guess the closest with Beren and Luthien and maybe the Children of Húrin. And the Children of Húrin obviously are kind of stand out there because they are probably the straightest, like the closest like Tolkien ever came to just ripping a myth straight off, because it is super close to the story of Kullervo in the Kalevala, which once again you should read because weird sexual allusions to bears. And if that doesn't entice you, I don't know what will. But Honey Paws, My Sweet is just the beginning. Go read the Kalevala. Anyway, so the Children of Húrin, that whole story about incest and all the other stuff, is like extremely tragic and very close both to, like, as I said, Finnish mythology, where it's lifted from, but the kind of thing you have also in like Greek mythologies. It fits that mold in a way. It also, and this I guess is the other part where you can like find enjoyment in the Silmarillion, is the hints and mentions of stuff that becomes important later on in the Lord of the Rings, like those mentions of Gandalf in like the 2nd chapter, when he's just mentioned as Olorin being the wisest of the Maiar. You can completely overlook that. Or Ungoliant being the grandparent and first like line in that, first like sire, whatever you want to call her, of Shelob, who killed her, there's a lot of that stuff going on there. And I feel that's sort of what I figured out after the end of it this time again, because I just, like, read Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion in one go. I'm like, the Silmarillion manages to, as a book of mythology, to just connect everything together in an amazing way, in a like really fantastic way, where you all these like small details, and you look and you can step back and say, yeah, that all makes sense. There might be predestination, or maybe not. We don't care that much at this point, but there's all these things that sort of kind of make sense. Everything is connected to everything, and you get that feeling that Tolkien, I feel, that has like done so much for that like whole idea of Tolkien being like the grandfather of fantasy and the master of world building and whatnot. It's like that the Silmarillion, in its like super dry, weird way, makes the whole universe that you see in those novels before feel whole, and adds a lot of depth to it in a lot of interesting ways. And it's sort of what, like a lot of world builders ever since have tried to emulate, because they probably didn't get it right, because they're like, yeah, I'll do the same, and then they start drawing maps and thinking about weather formations, and Tolkien never in his life thought about weather formations. That was never his point. Okay, I feel like one final thing that I should mention is that possible connection that Middle Earth is sort of a mythical part of our living world and stuff like that, which there's a few hints here and there in Tolkien's writings, but not many. And it's right, sheerly, sheer fictitious, like whatever, you can think about it or not. It's just like an imaginary thing, but it's important to keep in mind. One of them is that at the end of the fall of Numenor, when it sinks, and it's like people only talk about it and call it this and this and this and Atalanta, and I'm like, okay, interesting. There's that idea. And you can totally talk about the idea that Elvenhome and Valinor has been removed and the world has now become round and curved, like our planet has, unless you are one of those people. And you can still reach like the mythical West, which is an imaginary thing. It's about your imagination. That's the place that is out there, that other world, that world of fantasy. And I feel that's like a very beautiful way to think about that realm of fantasy, because it still, like, the realm of fantasy influences us. It does a lot. So having that idea there, I feel, is important. So yeah, that's me ranting about why I love the Silmarillion. I hope you took something out of it. If not, yell at me in the comments. If so, yell at me in the comments. Let's have us a debate and stuff. And thanks for actually bearing with me this far. I'll see you tomorrow with the rest of part 2 of Forge of Darkness, and then there will be the weekend and more stuff. Anyway, have a great Thursday evening. Cheers.